Hello, welcome back. Thanks for joining me. In this video, I'm going to go through sidechaining in relation to kicks. Very common way is using Ableton's compressor, creating a muted kick channel, and pulling down the threshold and ducking that kick to get that sucking bass sound. And I do use it sometimes. But I personally prefer, when it comes to that particular scenario, to use the Ableton Fades on the audio. So I'm going to go through and show each way. There's no right or wrong. It's just probably preference to a workflow and then the sound, because the sound can vary on each way you do it. So hit like, hit subscribe. Let's boogie. So I've set up. I've just laid two kicks. So you'll see here SC sidechain. I've just muted kick channel. You'll see the decay in the tail's not too long. There is some space there. That can also determine the sound of the sound of the sidechain. I like to keep it short and have a gap there, particularly because if I'm going to have like a rumble or a bass, I do sort of want it to duck the start of the kick. Not every time, but in most cases. So I like to have that gap in the muted sidechain channel. So kick drums, standard. And I'm just going to set up different scenarios. So what I've done is, if I go to here, this is just a MIDI clip, just with a Ableton wavetable, in case you like the preset, altered harmonic bass. So I've just drawn, same as the kick drum, not really fussed about the key right now, I've just gone low to get a bass sound. Let's hear it. So obviously it's one repetitive sound. So what I want to do is, I want to throw the compressor on there. This is just Ableton stock. Over here, this arrow will open up extra settings for the sidechain and the EQ. We'll turn the sidechain on, and I'm going to select the audio input to be SC. You can label that whatever you want, and you can sidechain any channel you want. I'll leave the filters as they are for now. Flick it over to this view here, and if we have it off, turn it on, the threshold, we can see the pulse of the kick. So as we pull the threshold down, it's going to trigger the compressor, it's gain reducing, and it's ducking that kick, and now we're getting some movement rather than one whole note. Now, it's an extremely common practice. It's nothing new. It can be very effective. It can contribute to your mix down as well. I'm not going to dive too deep into it, but that's the most common way. I found that if I want to duck the kick, more so in relation to a bass sound or a low end sound, even though it can be done for percussion and hi-hats and anything else, but that's sort of the quickest way just to, let's start ducking that kick. And this is before going into, EQing and actually mixing the two, right? So even though this contributes to your mix, it also is part of the production phase, I believe, because it's going to shape the sound. So from that to now that, if we play it over the kick, it could change the whole vibe. So without going into the EQ and the filters too much, obviously all your compressor settings will change that along with the filter. I have now frozen this to audio, so we're going to hear the same thing here. Personally though, in this scenario, I like to use the Ableton Fades, and that's why I've frozen it as well. You could achieve the same result if you take your time to try and match that, but let's turn them on, we can A/B them. The reason why I like using the Ableton Fades is I've got more control over it. Even though that can be argued because you've got the settings in the compressor to change to probably get to the same spot as what I'm doing with the audio fades. But for my personal workflow, I'd rather fuck around with the fades. And the reason being as well, I can change the fade on every kick drum if I wanted to give it more movement or multiple movements. And you could do that with the compressor too. Like you could, let's say, delete that. You know, you could change the pattern of your sidechain channel to get more movement if it wasn't just a generic offbeat bass. But with the fades, you got, and I find it a bit quicker as well. You know, like you can do this, say. You know, so you can like just turn that one down because it's sort of a bit louder. But you can just bring that clip volume down. So that's one of the reasons. And you know, if you do it quickly, you can just, and it is going to sound different. If we go back to here, you know, we can get more aggressive with it. We can change with, so you can really make it pump. But again, I just personally like the fades. I find it quicker for workflow, and visually, I can see exactly how the waveform's going to be. And even though you can set your sidechain up on the compressor and then freeze that to audio and get your waveform, but I can do it live, you know, so I can sort of be, and that's what I mean. You can be a bit more creative as well and a lot faster. Because essentially we're achieving the same thing. In this very basic scenario, we're achieving the same thing. We're ducking the kick. So ducking the kick will contribute to the sound of the end result sound of the audio you're sidechaining. But visually as well, we can see, like, we're going to have low end in the kick, and if this was more of a rumble sound, we'd have low end in the rumble. And even though we're going to have clashing frequencies between the kick drum and the low end, physically though, we can see it. If we were aiming for this type of offbeat suck sound, like if I consolidate this waveform, we can see, even though they'll have clashing frequencies in the low end, they're going to hit at different times. By the time this sort of peaks up halfway through the kick, we'll still have the tail of the kick. Obviously, we can look after that with EQing between both channels, and depending how much, you could even just shape that last bit off if you wanted to. So let's say if we, you know, you can sort of do the mixing with the fades as well. That's not going to be the case every time, because sometimes your kick will have a longer tail and it will overlap with the low end regardless, which is very common in, you know, techno and EDM and electronic music. But I like doing it this way, because I can sort of see visually as well how much I'm ducking the kick. If I don't like it, I can just bring it back and change the fade. But you can get so much more movement, I've found, even though you can tweak the settings on the compressor, but you're doing it live. You can, you know, you could do the whole bar at different sizes and rates, and then not get a melody, but get so much movement. Now, if we consolidate this, because it's already frozen, by consolidating the fades, we're going to see it in real time as well in this view. So without even pulling up EQs and trying to mix the two yet, very basically you can take care of a lot of housekeeping issues potentially just by having things out the way, you know. Now, that's just a wavetable synth. Even if we go, you know, there's going to be other elements that you want to sidechain. Even if we go to more of a like cinematic pad, let's throw a compressor on here. Let's set it up the same way. We'll sidechain it. Okay, let's have a look. Let's turn it on. And this is just an example. You might not always be sidechaining a pad. It's going to depend on the mood and the goal of your track, right? But in the context of showing the compressor versus the fades, if I duplicate it, get rid of the compressor, something like this would be harder to do with the fades because it might not sound as natural or as organic, because, and this could take a bit longer, to be honest, because there's more movement in this sound. It's not just the same repeating sound, it's an evolving sound. So it might sound unnatural depending how you do your fades. You're sort of going to have to maybe do both sides so the release isn't so cut offish. So in a situation like that, I would reach for the compressor. For workflow in that way, that would be quicker and easier, and it would sound more natural. You could spend the time on the fades to get it there, but I don't think you'd get it as natural feeling, because as well, there's only so much you can really bend. Like you got a bit of leverage, but it's not too precise either. It's way more effective for the offbeat bass or anything like that. But if you're maybe taking only a section out of the pad and you weren't using it to be an evolving sound, maybe that could work. You know, if you weren't having the whole thing play. Or if you're resampling and trying to create a sound from an existing sample, you could use your fades to chop it up and, you know, without even transposing it and processing it, you could get a new loop out of the loop just by using the fades. You know, and then you can obviously just reverse. Be careful when you consolidate, because these little fuckers freeze to audio and they can fuck up your mix as well. So that's for a pad. And then even for percussion though, if you're using a sample, or even if you draw in your own pattern for percussion, you can obviously, if you're drawing it in, you've got control of where things are going to be placed. If you're using a sample straight out of the box and you like it and you don't really need to play with it too much because it's just a pretty simple generic hat, do you need to sidechain it? Well, that's going to be personal choice, right? But what are the advantages if you do use the compressor or if you do use the fades? The fades and the compressor aren't always going to be a versus situation where you can use both in every situation. It's going to be optional depending on the context of when you're using it. But I do use sometimes the compressor on percussion just to lightly give it some movement. Now again, if we just very simply, let's turn this off. Let's listen to the hat. Turn it down a bit. There's already movement in the hat. You can see by the waveform there's different dynamics, right? There's different peaks and troughs. But the compressor can just, with the side chaining, can bounce it a bit more, right? Now, using the fades on something like this, is it beneficial? Is it necessary? Again, that's going to be up to you in the context of your project and your track as well. But sometimes I do use the fades if I don't use the compressor. It's going to depend on what I'm trying to achieve. Something like this, let me just think for a second. You know, if something like this was an issue to you, where that high note is clashing with the kick drum, and let's say you didn't want to set the compressor up, I'd either Command E and just bring it down naturally in volume, but then it's just going to be pretty much just compressing. You just make it 40. You could eliminate the movement, but if I was going to chop the sample up, and let's say it looked a bit different, I don't like that. So let's say I've made it this way. I've sort of rearranged the loop, and I like it better this way. You could still just use the compressor on there, or if you just wanted to maybe more so from a mixing perspective rather than the sound, you could just duck the start of the kick just to shorten the attack. You know, and that might be enough to get you where you want to go. But again, if that was something you're conscious of, by using the fades and working this way in real time, once you consolidate, you'll see the waveform change. You know, now the hi-hat and the kick are going to have different frequency pockets, so it's not going to clash per se, but you can let the kick come out a bit more. It's going to be subjective and really it depends on the context. But yeah, the fades I use heavily. I use them to reshape samples. I use them to contribute to my mindset towards mixing, arrangement, letting things come in and out. And, you know, something as small as that, I do that sometimes, you know. And by freezing the waveform in real time and consolidating your fades, you can see where they end up. So even from an arrangement point of view, it can be helpful. I think the fades are very important, but are probably most efficient if it's a fades versus compressor sidechain scenario. I'd probably find it most beneficial if you're working on a rumble or a low end, because we can duck the kick, right? Outside of that, it'd be personal choice and depending on your workflow and context, if you're going to use fades or if you're going to use the compressor. So this wasn't like a versus battle. I just wanted to give an insight to, even though I use the compressor sometimes, quite simply like that with those settings straight off the shelf, I do like to use the fades heavily as well. And if you don't use the fades and use the compressor or vice versa, I'd invite you to just play around with either way, because you can get different options from the two different applications. So yeah, I hope that was helpful. Like and subscribe, and I'll be back next week. Arrivederci.